In this lesson, you will learn to convert a percent to a fraction and a fraction to a percent by applying the knowledge that a percent represents a whole divided into 100 equal parts. Our goal is to apply previous understanding of factors and fractions to find decimal and percent equivalents. Equivalence, of course, means equal. So, what is a percent and how are they used? Well, percents are useful for comparing ratios with different denominators. For example, it's a lot better to compare sales tax as a percent than it is to convert it to a fractions in many occurrences. So let's look at your vocabulary. The word percent means per hundred or each hundred. A percent is a ratio whose denominator is 100. The symbol given here, percent, represents the percent. Go ahead and take a minute to write down your vocabulary definitions. So let's review. A percent represents a whole divided into 100 equal parts. So 17% can be represented as 17 over 100, which of course is modeled here. So some common mistakes are moving the decimal in a wrong direction and misinterpreting place value. You're going to see these are common mistakes in another tutorial as well. And we will get into those common mistakes more in depth when we look at converting decimals to percents, fractions, and look at all three. But in this case, what I really want you to take away is, if this was our percent, we would not represent it as 1 over 100, whereas instead we have to look at it as percent out of 100 and move the decimal accordingly, making it 1/10,000ths. And like I said, we'll get into that more in depth and later, but just be careful that you don't misrepresent a decimal as a percent and vice versa. So how do I write a percent as a fraction? Well, let's look at an example like 37%. Again, our goal is to set any percent equal to a fraction of 0. So that's your first, or 100, sorry. So that's our first step. Percent means per 100. And oftentimes, if you've seen miles per gallon, we have this little per sign. That can actually help you remember that that should be your fraction. So 37 per 100. And of course, our percentage is our numerator. So if we have 37% or per 100, we have 37 over 100. Now, our next step is to simplify if necessary. In the case of 37 hundredths, it's in simplest form. Now let's look at 50%. 50%, of course, 50 per 100. So 50 over 100. And now, of course, we need to say, do we need to simplify? In this case, of course, there's a few things that you can apply your knowledge of factors and finding the least common multiple, greatest common factor. We can factor out a 10. We can also factor out that 5 and get 1/2, because 5/10 is also 1/2. So 50% is 1/2. Let's look at another example. So if we look at 42%, that can give us 42 per 100. Or, because we can factor out a 2 in both of these cases, and of course we want to simplify if possible, so that would give us 21 over 50. And that is in simplest form. So 42% is 21 over 50. Now looking at 36%, of course, we'll start with 36 per 100. It's a really good place to start. And then we can simplify if necessary. 36 and 100 are both divisible by 4, which would give us 9 out of 25. So those are converting percents into fractions. A lot of students find this part a little bit simpler. Just remember to set any percent equal to a fraction out of 100 and to simplify if possible. Another thing I want to point out is that remember that you're using the identity property to reduce fractions because you're just dividing by 1. And when we multiply or divide by 1, we get the same result. In other words, 21 out of 50 multiplied by 2 over 2 would give us 42 hundredths. We're going to discuss why this is important later, but make sure you have this concept down. Now, let's look at going the opposite way. How would I convert a fraction to a percent? Well, let's look at some examples. We have 4/5. Now, we remember from previous tutorials we learned about cross products or cross multiplication. So we can say 4 out of 5 equals what out of 100? If it's a difficult number, we can use cross products to solve. 5 times what equals 400. Divide 400 by 5 to isolate the variable, and we get x equals 20. Some of you might, of course, also know that, well, 5 times what is 100? Sorry, 80. I was getting ahead of myself there. 5 times what is 100? And of course, 5 times 20 is 100. And 4 times 20 would give you 80. So we have, let me clean that up for you. 4 out of 5 would equal 80 hundredths. And now that you have that hundredths, you have the percent. 80%. There is one more way to do these, and that's to divide the bottom into the top, in other words, 4 divided by 5, and convert the decimal to a percent. But we're actually going to get into that in another tutorial. But if you already know that strategy, I still want you to look at it as per hundredths because it's really important to understanding why the math works. Now let's look at 3/4. 3/4 equals what number out of 100? Well, again, hopefully you remember 4 times 25, or 4/4, is 100. And 3 times 25 would give you 75. So we have 75 hundredths. 7/10 20. Good. I hope that you were able to figure parts of these out on your own, and I hope this is really refreshing your brain on converting percents to fractions and fractions to percents. Now I want you to take a minute to look at some common percents. These you should definitely write down. You don't necessarily have to draw the pictures, but I have the pictures that I found for you in order to show you the common percents. And then I listed others for you. So we have 10%, 25%, and 50%. Those are very, very common. And then we have some other common fractions that you'll see as percents. And one thing I want to point out, 66.6 repeating percent is 2/3, and 33.3 repeating percent is 1/3. So take a minute to pause this tutorial and write down a table with some common percents. Go ahead and take a minute to pause now. So a common question I get is, why do I need to convert a percent to a fraction or a fraction to a percent? Well, sometimes it's easier to look at a percent as a fraction or a fraction as a percent. You've probably heard the weather person say there's a 30% chance of rain. Now what that means is 30 per 100, which is 3/10. And you would, of course, get that by reducing it, dividing both sides by 10, and having that knowledge that 3/10 times 10/10 gives you 30% would let you know, well, if I had 10 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I could then say, well, if there's a 30% chance of rain over the next 10 days, I would understand that 3 of those 10 days would have rain. Possibly. So understanding those conversions can really help you. Likewise, if I said in a class of 30 students, 25 out of the 30 students received an A on a test, that of course can be translated to a percent. So we of course would say, well, 25 over 30 can be reduced to 5, 6 equals what out of 100? We would have to use cross products in this case because 6 and 100 aren't distributed evenly. And we of course would get 6 times what equals 500. And our answer would be about 83 1/3%. So I could say, wow, about 83 1/3% of our class received an A on their last test. So again, this is where it can help you really understand mathematical concepts and make sense out of real-world problems. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and write the percent as a fraction in simplest form. When you're finished, you can write the fractions as percents. Go ahead and take a minute to pause the tutorial and start that now. So another excellent job today, mathematicians. In this lesson, you learned to convert any fraction to a percent and a percent to a fraction by looking at it as part of 100, 100 being the whole. Don't forget to always simplify if possible and to think about how you can relate it to the real world. Excellent job again!